The imperial cult of ancient Rome identified emperors and some members of their families with the divinely sanctioned authority of the Roman state. The framework for the imperial cult was formulated during the early Principate of Augustus, and was rapidly established throughout the empire and its provinces, with marked local variations in its reception and expression. Evolution of the imperial cult. Augustus' reforms transformed Rome's republican system of government to a de facto monarchy, couched in traditional Roman practices and republican values. The princeps was expected to balance the interests of the Roman military, senate and people, and to maintain peace, security and prosperity throughout an ethnically diverse empire. The official offer of cultus to a living emperor acknowledged his office and rule as divinely approved and constitutional. His principate should therefore demonstrate pious respect for traditional republican deities and mores. A deceased emperor held worthy of the honor could be voted a state divinity by the Senate and elevated as such in an act of apotheosis. The granting of apotheosis served religious, political and moral judgment on imperial rulers and allowed living emperors to associate themselves with a well-regarded lineage of imperial divi, from which unpopular or unworthy predecessors were excluded. This proved a useful instrument to Vespasian in his establishment of the Flavian imperial dynasty following the death of Nero and civil war, and to Septimius in his consolidation of the Severan dynasty after the assassination of Commodus. In the development of imperial rule from principate to dominate, the role of the Senate was increasingly marginalized and military loyalty became the key to imperial authority. The imperial cult was inseparable from that of Rome's official deities, whose cult was essential to Rome's survival and whose neglect was therefore treasonous. Traditional cult was a focus of imperial revivalist legislation under Decius and Diocletian. Christian apologists and martyrologists saw the cult of the emperor as a particularly offensive instrument of pagan impiety and persecution. It therefore became a focus of theological and political debate during the ascendancy of Christianity under Constantine I. The Emperor Julian failed to reverse the declining support for Rome's official religious practices. Theodosius I adopted Christianity as Rome's state religion. Rome's traditional gods and imperial cult were officially abandoned. However, many of the rites, practices and status distinctions that characterized the cult to emperors were perpetuated in the theology and politics of the Christianized empire. Background. Roman. For 5 centuries, the Roman Republic did not give worship to any historic figure, or any living man. Although surrounded by divine and semi-divine monarchies, Rome's legendary kings had been its masters. With their removal, Republican Romans could identify Romulus, the founder of the city, with the god Quirinus and still retain Republican liberty. Similarly, Aeneas was worshipped as Jupiter indiges. The Romans worshipped several gods and demigods who had been human, and knew the theory that all the gods had originated as human beings. Yet republican traditions were staunchly conservative and anti-monarchic. The aristocrats who held almost all Roman magistracies, and thereby occupied almost all of the Senate, acknowledged no human as their inherent superior. No citizen, living or dead, was officially regarded as divine, but the honors awarded by the state, crowns, garlands, statues, thrones, processions, were also suitable to the gods, untinged with divinity. Indeed, when the emperors were later given state worship, it was done by a decree of the Senate, phrased like any other honor. Among the highest of honors was the triumph. When a general was acclaimed imperator by his troops, the Senate would then choose whether to award him a triumph, a parade to the capital in which the triumphator displayed his captives and spoils of war in the company of his troops. By law, all were unarmed. The triumphator rode in a chariot, bearing divine emblems, in a manner supposed to be inherited from the ancient kings of Rome, and ended by offering his victory to Jupiter Capitolinus. Some scholars have viewed the triumphator as impersonating or even becoming a king or a god for the day, but the circumstances of triumphal award and subsequent rites also function to limit his status. Whatever his personal ambitions, his victory and his triumph alike served the Roman Senate, people and gods, and were recognized only through their consent. In private life, however, tradition required that some human beings be treated as more or less divine. Cult was due from familial inferiors to their superiors. Every head of household embodied the genius, the generative principle and guardian spirit, of his ancestors, which others might worship and by which his family and slaves took oaths. His wife had a Juno. A client could call his patron Jupiter on earth. The dead, collectively and individually, were gods of the underworld or afterlife. A letter has survived from Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi, expecting that when she was dead, her sons would venerate her as Deus Parens, a parental divinity. Such piety was expected from any dutiful son. A prominent clan might claim divine influence and quasi-divine honors for its leader. Death masks were made for all notable Romans and were displayed in the atria of their houses. They were used to represent their ghostly presence at family funerals. The mask of Scipio Africanus, Cornelia's father and victor over Hannibal, was stored in the Temple of Jupiter. His epitaph said that he had ascended to heaven. A tradition arose in the centuries after his death that Africanus had been inspired by prophetic dreams, and was himself the son of Jupiter. There are several cases of unofficial cult directed at men viewed as saviors, military or political. In further Spain in the 70s BC, loyalist Romans greeted the proconsul Metellus Pius as a savior, burning incense, as if to a god, for his efforts to quash the Lusitanian rebellion led by the Roman Sertorius, a member of the faction which called itself Men of the People. This celebration, in Spain, featured a lavish banquet with local and imported delicacies, and a mechanical statue of Victory to crown Metellus, who wore a triumphator's toga picta for the occasion. These festivities were organized by the quaestor Gaius Urbinus, but were not acts of the state. Metellus liked all this, but his older and pious contemporaries thought it arrogant and intolerable. After the land reformers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were both murdered by their opponents, their supporters fell down and offered daily sacrifice at the statues of the Gracchi, as though they were visiting the shrines of the gods. After Gaius Marius defeated the Teutones, private citizens would offer food and drink to him alongside their household gods. He was called the third founder of Rome after Romulus and Camillus. In 86 BC, offerings of incense and wine were made at crossroads shrines to statues of the still-living Marius Gratidianus, the nephew of the elder Marius, who was wildly popular in his own right, in large part for monetary reforms that eased an economic crisis in Rome during his praetorship. Greek, where the Romans began to dominate large parts of the Greek world. Rome's senior representatives there were given the same divine honors as were Hellenistic rulers. This was a well-established method for Greek city-states to declare their allegiance to an outside power. Such a cult committed the city to obey and respect the king as they obeyed and respected Apollo or any of the other gods. The cities of Ionia worshipped the Spartan general Lysander, when he personally dominated Greece. Immediately following the Peloponnesian War, according to Plutarch, this was the first instance of ruler cult in Greek history. There were similar instances of divine cult to humans in the same century, although some rulers, like Agesilaus, declined it. Clearchus, tyrant of Heraclea, dressed up like Zeus and claimed godhood. This did not stop the Heracleites from assassinating him. Isocrates said of Philip II of Macedon that after he conquered the Persian Empire, there would be nothing for him to attain but to become a god. The city of Amphipolis, and a private society at Athens, worshipped him even without this conquest. He himself set out his statue, dressed as a god, as the 13th of the 12 Olympians. But it was Philip's son Alexander the Great who made the divinity of kings standard practice among the Greeks. The Egyptians accepted him as pharaoh, and therefore divine. After he drove the Persians out of Egypt, other nations received him as their traditional divine or quasi-divine ruler as he acquired them. In 324, he sent word to the Greek cities that they should also make him a god. They did so, with marked indifference, which did not stop them from rebelling when they heard of his death next year. His immediate successors, the Diadochi, offered sacrifices to Alexander, and made themselves gods even before they claimed to be kings. They put their own portraits on the coinage, whereas the Greeks had always reserved this for a god or for an emblem of the city. When the Athenians allied with Demetrius Poliorcetes, 18 years after the deification of Alexander, they lodged him in the Parthenon with Athena, and sang a hymn extolling him as a present god, who heard him, as the other gods did not. Euhemerus, a contemporary of Alexander, wrote a fictitious history of the world, which showed Zeus and the other established gods of Greece as mortal men, who had made themselves into gods in the same way. Ennius appears to have translated this into Latin some 2 centuries later. In Scipio Africanus, a time, the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids claimed godhood as long as they lasted. They may have been influenced in this by the Persian and Egyptian traditions of divine kings, although the Ptolemies had separate cults in Egyptian polytheism, as pharaoh, and in the Greek. Not all Greek dynasties are made the same claims. The descendants of Demetrius, who were kings of Macedon and dominated the mainland of Greece, did not claim godhead or worship Alexander. Romans. Among the Greeks, the Roman magistrates who conquered the Greek world were fitted into this tradition. Games were set up in honor of M. Claudius Marcellus when he conquered Sicily at the end of the Second Punic War. As the Olympian Games were for Zeus, they were kept up for a century and a half until another Roman governor abolished them, to make way for his own honors. When T. Quinctius Flamininus extended Roman influence to Greece proper, temples were built for him and cities placed his portrait on their coinage. He called himself godlike in an inscription at Delphi, but not in Latin, or at Rome. The Greeks also devised a goddess Roma, not worshipped at Rome, who was worshipped with Flamininus. She would become a symbol of idealized Romanitas in the later Roman provinces, and a continuing link, whereas a Marcellus or Flamininus might only hold power for a couple years. When King Prusiaza I of Bithynia was granted an interview by the Roman Senate, he prostrated himself and addressed them as savior gods, which would have been etiquette at his own court. Livy was shocked by Polybius' account of this, and insists that there is no Roman source it ever happened. Worship and temples appear to have been routinely offered to Roman governors. Their reaction varied. Cicero declined a temple proposed by the city officials of Roman Asia to his brother and himself, while the latter was proconsul, to avoid jealousy from other Romans. When Cicero himself was governor of Cilicia, he claimed to have accepted no statues, shrines, or chariots. His predecessor, Appius Claudius Pulcher, was so pleased, however, when the Cilicians built a temple to him that, when it was not finished at the end of Claudius' a year in office, Claudius wrote Cicero to make sure it was done, and complaining that Cicero was not active enough in the matter. Intermediate forms. The Romans and the Greeks gave religious reverence to and for human beings in ways that did not make the recipients gods. These made the first Greek apotheoses easier. Similar middle forms appeared as Augustus approached official divinity. The Greeks did not consider the dead to be gods, but they did pay them homage, and give them sacrifices, using different rituals than those for the gods of Olympus. The Greeks called the extraordinary dead, founders of cities and the like, heroes, in the simplest form. Hero cult was the burial and the memorials which any respectable Greek family gave their dead, but paid for by their city in perpetuity. Most heroes were the figures of ancient legend, but some were historical. The Athenians revered Harmodius and Aristogeiton as heroes, as saviors of Athens from tyranny. Also, collectively, those who fell at the Battle of Marathon. Statesmen did not generally become heroes, but Sophocles was the hero Dexian, not as a playwright, nor a general, but because, when the Athenians took Aesculapius, a cult during the Peloponnesian War, he housed it until a shrine could be built. The Athenian leader Hannion founded Amphipolis shortly before the Peloponnesian War, 13 years later, while Hannion was still alive. The Spartan general Brasidas liberated it from the Athenian Empire, and was fatally wounded in the process. The Amphipolitans buried him as a hero, declaring him the second founder of the city, and erased Hannion's honors as much as they could. The Greeks also honored founders of cities while they were still alive, like Hannion. This could also be extended to men who did equally important things. During the period when Dion ruled in Syracuse, the Syracusans gave him heroic honors for suppressing the tyrants, and repeated this for Timoleon. These could also be described as worshipping his good spirit. Timoleon was called Savior. He set up a shrine to Fortune in his house, and his birthday, the festival of his daimon, became a public holiday. Other men might claim divine favor by having a patron among the gods, so Alcibiades may have had both Eros and Cybele as patrons, and Clearchus of Heracles claimed to be son of Zeus. Alexander claimed the patronage of Dionysus and other gods and heroes. He held a banquet at Bactra which combined the toast to his Agathos daimon and libations to Dionysus, who was present within Alexander. It was not always easy to distinguish between heroic honors, veneration for a man's good spirit, worship of his patron deity, worship of the fortune of a city he founded, and worship of the man himself. One might slide into another. In Egypt, there was a cult of Alexander as god and as founder of Alexandria. Ptolemy I Soter had a separate cult as founder of Ptolemais, which presumably worshipped his daimon and then gave him heroic honors, but in his son's reign, the priests of Alexander also worshipped Ptolemy and Berenice as the savior gods. Finally, a man might, like Philip II, assume some prerogatives of godhood and not others. The first Attalid kings, of Pergamum, were not gods, and supported a cult of Dionysus Kathagemon. As their ancestor, they put the picture of Philetarus, the first prince, on the coins, rather than their own. Eventually, like the Seleucids, they acquired an eponymous priest and put themselves on the coinage, but they still were not called gods before their deaths. Pergamum was usually allied with Rome, and this may have influenced the eventual Roman practice.